Hello everyone, welcome to Microeconomics. The subject for today is monopoly. Within this section, we're going to cover the monopoly model, the characteristics of monopoly, single price monopoly structure, the natural monopoly conditions, and price discriminatory strategies within monopoly, and other particular important subjects. Now, the big question is, why do monopolies often exist? And monopolies exist for various reasons. Within a monopolized industry, we have a situation where a monopolist is a single seller that possesses significant market power. And in this particular market, they are able to set the price and they produce limited output than competitive market and control the industry heavily. So they have the characteristics of being a price setter, a price searcher, they maximize profit, produce limited output, and the industry is controlled by one specific firm that has significant market power. So the monopoly controls the industry by itself significantly. It's highly profitable in the short run, medium run, and long run. It sells the products that have no close substitutes and are very expensive to some extent. So the cases of monopolies, they sell products that have no close substitutes in the case of a pure monopoly. And this allows them to charge a higher price and produce limited output. Unlike a competitive industry where the product is relatively standard, you have many producers selling a good or service. In a monopoly structure, the firm controls everything. Now, the different types of monopolies can come from a private monopoly, a single price monopoly, a market monopoly. When we're looking at a government-created monopoly as well, government can allow the creation of a particular company to behave and operate as a monopoly. A company can establish itself as a natural producer of a good or service, which becomes a natural monopoly. A company naturally produces the product for the entire industry for the specific good or service. And then we have other situations of monopoly structures. There's a difference between monopoly, pure monopoly, and a monopoly structure situation. In monopoly conditions, the industry, which is controlled by one single firm or primarily one firm, has what is called barriers to entry. And this barriers to entry consists of limiting other firms entering the industry by controlling natural resources, controlling the inputs of production, the raw materials, the raw minerals to produce a particular good. And in some cases, a company can experience what is called economies of scale. And economies of scale is a situation in which a firm, as it produces more output, it has a cost advantage. Cost decreases as the production increases, scale production, and the cost declines, giving the company a significant cost advantage to produce goods and services. Average total cost declines as the firm produces more of a particular good. And in various cases, depending on the company's technology capability, technological superiority allows the firm to have some monopoly power or some power over other firms. Often cases we see the creation of legal government-created barriers that include such as patents, exclusive copyrights, legal franchise rights to one specific firm that limit other firms from competing and establish one company as the main provider of a good, or essentially a monopoly in this case. So public franchise rights is one of those that are exclusively given to one firm for one brand or for one particular good or different goods in the market, controlled by one company or one firm. Consider, for example, the big giants in the online field, such as the following mentioned here: Google, Facebook, Amazon, and so on. All of them control specifically certain things. Google dominates the online searching engines for the most part, has a significant market dominance. Facebook dominates social media and a lot of platforms, although there's a lot of new ones that are coming up. Amazon used to dominate the online retail center. Other companies are now challenging the Amazon platform. So we have, this is, for example, various different types of market monopolies, social media monopolies. And then we have, for example, a private company like De Beers in the diamond industry that controls the distribution, or used to control the production, distribution, and the retail sector of the diamond industry. So what did De Beers do? It bought out producers that attempted to compete with De Beers. It went into agreements with local governments that used to control the mines and the production sites of the actual mineral, which is a diamond, and later it privatized everything, the distribution, the production, distribution, and the retail centers as well. So De Beers in the diamond industry is a great example, and this is what we're going to be using for the class as a private monopoly, market monopoly, pure monopoly in this case, that would charge primarily one price, although monopolies can charge different prices. We're going to assume one price for first, and we're going to distinguish the difference between a market monopoly in this case and a natural monopoly later on. We're going to start with the diamond industry because the diamonds are everybody's, or for the most part, the majority of the people we used to desire a diamond for engagement, and it is a heavily priced luxury item. Although it's not a necessity, it's more of a luxury good. It doesn't fully guarantee the success of a marriage, but it's an enjoyable utility measure condition. Very expensive. So let's take a look at the diamond industry, how it has controlled prices by some companies, in this case like this one mentioned, De Beers, and it controls the distribution of diamonds to some extent. We have an example here of diamonds that could be quite expensive depending on the carat, the rarity, clarity, and so on. This one is $46,000, highly expensive, above market, significant market price. So suppose we have, in this case, a monopoly that has a downward sloping demand curve. And we have our first case scenario where if the firm were to charge $142 for a small diamond, just a little small diamond, the firm will charge 142 times 3 units produced. That will be the total revenue. 142 times 3, that in this case will be the total revenue of the firm. And if the firm decides to potentially lower the price from 142 to 132, now the new revenue will be $132 times, in this case, the 4 units, and it will give us a new revenue. Here we see a traditional demand curve that is downward sloping, and if you lower the price, you're going to lose, in this case, revenue per unit. The marginal revenue per unit here, you have lowered the price, so you lose revenue per unit. In this case, you have a loss. You're losing $10, 142 minus 132, $10 for every unit sold. But if you sell that extra unit, you're going to gain additional monetary value, $132 more by selling that extra unit. So in this case, if we have a downward sloping demand curve for a particular good, in this case, if it's the same case for a monopoly demand curve, a firm will only lower the price of a particular good if in doing so, it generates additional gains. Otherwise, it may generate significant losses. So in this case, if we have one particular good that is priced at 142, to lower the price, we may lower the price if in doing so, it's going to generate additional gains. Otherwise, don't lower the price. So for a monopoly, we're going to have a downward sloping demand curve. And the marginal revenue for a monopoly structure is going to follow very closely the demand curve in this case. In a monopoly, the price is not equivalent to the marginal revenue. The marginal revenue, it's downward sloping as well, meaning that you can only cut price so much before you start losing any gains. You can't lower the price all of the time. So let's take a look at a monopoly's demand curve and the total revenue relationship and marginal revenue curves. So going back to our diamond example, we have the price in the vertical axis, our cost of production, our marginal revenue of demand in this case. So we have the price in the vertical axis, our cost in the vertical axis, our marginal revenue of demand here, and we have, as I mentioned, our demand curve for goods and services is traditionally downward sloping. We have a downward sloping demand curve. And our marginal revenue is going to follow our demand for goods and services, which is this one by the consumer, also a downward sloping curve, the light blue curve. Here we have the situation in which our first diamond, the price of the diamond, is going to be $550. $550 is our first diamond. $550 times 9, that gives us our total revenue at this price, at $550. And if we want to sell that additional diamond, the 10th diamond, the only reason why we want to sell that extra 10 diamond is because if you notice the marginal revenue here is still positive. You can still probably gain a little bit more revenue by selling that 10 diamond. But every time you lower the price, your marginal revenue per unit is going to decline. So we can lower the price to from $550 to $500. Only lower the price from $550 to $500. So we go from point A, which is 9 units, to point B, which is 10 at a lower price. If in doing so, if you look at the total revenue, at 10 units, we maximize total revenue here. So our revenue for 9 units was relatively high, at approximately 4,409 4,500, 940, 950. Our revenue here is relatively high, but it's not quite. It's maximized at $5,000, just exactly at 10 diamonds. At 9 diamonds, at a price of $550 times 9, we have approximately revenue of 4,950. If you lower the price, you're going to lower revenue by 50 units. So those 9 units, you're going to sell them at $50 less, $50 less, $50 less, $50 less, times 9. You're losing $450, but you're gaining an additional 500. So you're gaining an additional 500 by selling that extra diamond, which in this case, you sell that extra diamond, which is 10, at $500, you gain $50 more just by cutting the price in this situation. So if you only cut price up to a point where your total revenue is going to be maximized. Some people may be asking, what if we lower the price to 400? If we lower the price to like 400, at that point your marginal revenue is in the negatives, and your total revenue starts to decline. So don't lower price beyond a certain point. So in this case, diamonds are quite expensive because prices are kept relatively high to maximize total revenue. So in the first quadrant here, we have a quantity effect that dominates the price effect. You cut the price, you lower the price, but you're going to experience an increase in the units sold. So your quantity effect dominates the price effect, which is being cut, and you're still going to generate revenue. If you lower the price even more on the second quadrant, lowering the price lowers your revenue. You can sell more, but it's going to lower your revenue, meaning that cutting price has a positive relationship with less revenue. If you lower price, revenue will decline significantly more than your revenue maximum. So you want to set a price point at a specific point, in this case, that maximizes your total revenue for 10 diamonds at $500. Anything less will be counterproductive. So how do we maximize profit? Where to operate within a monopoly's conditions? Well, we need to consider those two effects. We have a quantity effect and a price effect. If you increase the production of the good or service, in that case was a diamond, if you increase production, that's an increase in the quantity produced to increase the production and sell. You can sell more units, and if you sell more, you generate an increase in total revenue. That's the situation in this case of the quantity effect. And you have a price that has been set where you can sell the good for a particular price, and if you increase quantity, you can sell them at that price. That's the quantity effect. The price effect means that in order to sell the extra units that you're producing, in order to sell it, you need to cut the price. You may necessarily have to lower the price on not just that one unit, but in all of the units. So if you have to lower price, think about it. If you flood the market with a lot of goods and services, which is in quantity, if you flood the market, eventually you have to lower the price in order to sell that product. So they work in opposite direction. If you increase quantity, you have to lower the price. So the monopolists here, the price effect, they move in the opposite direction. They're moving in opposite direction. The quantity effect is you sell more units, you can gain more revenue, but if you do so, you have to lower the price. The price effect here, if you to sell the extra unit, monopolists need to cut the price in order to sell it. And if you lower the price significantly more, you're going to experience a decline in revenue, a decrease in total revenue, which may not necessarily be good for the firm. So you want to set the quantity at a specific point that is profit maximizing, where you can profit maximize and not compromise the firm's price. So what is the monopolist profit maximizing optimal output rule? The monopolist profit maximizing output rule is as follows. Where marginal revenue is equivalent to marginal costs, the monopolist produces a quantity of output that generates the highest profits for the firm. In this situation, a monopoly will produce less output, or an output that it can control, and sell that output at a higher price than any competitive market. Again, the reason to control that output is in order to control or set the price as well, to maximize profit. A monopolist operates at a profit maximizing output condition, meaning that the marginal revenue for its good or service has to be greater or equal to its marginal cost, and where that occurs, the firm selects a optimal quantity of production. It produces that quantity, and it sets the price for that good or service. It sets the price. And in the monopoly situation, it will produce limited output. It will sell it at a higher price than industries that are highly competitive. Competitive industries sell a lot of output and lower prices. So when we're looking at the monopoly situation, let's take a look at the case of the diamond condition. We have our diamonds. We can produce 8, 10, 16, or 20 diamonds. And for this scenario, we have a $1,000 diamond, $600 diamond, or $200 diamond. In order to produce diamonds, they cost an X amount of dollars to produce. And consumers demand diamonds for engagements, and they generate some revenue for the firm. So we have the following demand for diamonds, which is the downward sloping demand curve. And we have the marginal revenue light curve, light blue curve that is downward sloping. And if you lower the price of the good, you can sell more, but your marginal revenue will decline as well, and your total revenue will decline. So in this case, we're going to have to operate where the monopoly can generate some profits. So suppose that the red curve indicated here, the marginal cost curve, is equivalent to the average total cost. The marginal cost per unit, the cost per unit, the additional units produced, have a marginal cost per unit of $200. To produce diamonds per unit, we have a constant cost of $200. The average total cost is constant, so it's equivalent to the marginal cost. So to produce 8 diamonds, it costs per unit in this case, on average, approximately $200. And PC indicates that if the industry was competitive, if we have an industry that was highly competitive, perfectly competitive industries will produce where the consumer demand is equivalent to the marginal cost, or at point C here, the consumer will pay, ideally, the cost of production, which is $200. So in a competitive market, they will produce more output, which will be 16 units. They will produce 16 units, and the consumer will consume those 16 units, so more output at a lower price, at $200. Basically, on average, at the cost of production, on average. A monopoly doesn't operate that way. A monopoly operates in a way that it will produce less output and set a price. So if we follow our rule, our optimal production rule, where marginal revenue of the last unit produced is equal to the marginal cost of the last unit produced, which happens at point A, both of them cross each other or intersect one another. At point A, we have fulfilled that condition. The monopoly, the quantity monopoly will be 8 units. It produces 8 units, and it's half as much as competitive industries, a lot less. And now they have the power or the ability to set a market price, which in this case is $600. Monopoly is going to charge $600 for a diamond that on average costs $200 to make. So they charge significantly more. and the monopoly is going to make a profit. The profit is the rectangle distance, which is labeled here as monopoly's profit, the vertical distance between $600 and the average cost of production, which is 200. 600 minus 200, so we have $400 per unit profit times 8 units. We have the monopoly's profit, which is a rectangle that is highlighted here. The distance between point B on the demand curve, but consumers are paying $600 for the diamond. And the monopoly's profit will be equivalent to the area of the model. So where marginal revenue is equivalent to marginal costs at exactly point A, where the firm produces 8 units, and for those 8 units, it sets the price per unit at $600. Notice that the monopoly here does not have supply curves. It does not have a supply curve because it controls the quantity of production and the quantity to maximize its profits. So here we have 400 minus 200, 600 minus 200 is 400 times 8, $3,200 in profit. Now, if we have a monopoly that has a nonlinear cost analysis where costs are changing all the time on average, we're going to have a different scenario of the area for profit and how it looks. The demand curve is always going to be downward sloping, and the marginal revenue is going to follow the demand curve very closely, and our average total cost is going to be represented by the purple curve that is U-shaped and then upward sloping. The marginal cost curve, it's downward sloping and then it increases after a certain point in this situation, and it intersects the marginal revenue curve, the blue curve, at point A. We need to highlight the steps for a monopoly's production ability. Step number 1, identify where marginal revenue is equal to marginal costs. Or more specifically, identify where those two curves meet. Where marginal revenue and marginal costs intersect, that occurs at point A. At point A, the firm produces a quantity monopoly, QM. This quantity monopoly is going to have an average cost on the purple curve, an average cost of production on the average cost curve. Not on this intersection, but on the average cost curve, point C, of an average total cost monopoly, ATCM. We need this because we're going to determine the firm's profits once we know what the price is, or we can set the price first and then determine the cost. But the monopoly is going to, now that it has an understanding of its quantity that's going to produce to maximize profit, it has an average cost of production at point C to produce that quantity of ATCM. The monopoly is going to go on the consumer demand and set the price right on the vertical point here on the demand curve and generate profits. The monopoly will always operate on its profit maximizing condition, meaning that wherever the marginal revenue and the marginal cost curve intersect, up here, down here, or right here, whatever they intersect, that's the starting point. That's step number 1, point A. Produce a profit maximizing quantity. Step number 2, what will be the average cost of production for our quantity monopoly? On the average total cost curve, we go to point C and find the average total cost monopoly. Step number 3, set the profit maximizing price on the demand curve at point B, the monopoly's price. Step number 4, calculate the monopoly's profit. So for the profit, we can use the 2 formulas that are very common. In this case, we're going to have our regular formula, which is profit is equal to total revenue minus total cost. Rearranging the formula so it meets the needs of our model, we know that total revenue is equivalent to the price of the good times the quantity of the units sold. Total revenue is the value of sales. And we know that total cost is the total cost of production. And by definition, we know that average total cost is equal to total cost divided by quantity. By rearranging this formula, we can find that total cost can be rearranged by ATC times quantity monopoly. The formula that we're going to be using for this analysis, price monopoly, the price monopoly, which is here, minus the average total cost times the quantity monopoly produced. That's the formula, this one. This is just the derivation of the formula, this step here. This formula, price monopoly, which is here, minus the average total cost of the monopoly times the quantity of the monopoly produced, that would generate the monopoly's profit. Basically the area here, the area of this rectangle. Price monopoly minus average total cost times the quantity produced. This is like if you're doing the length times base. The length, which is price minus average total cost, times the quantity of the monopoly, the rectangle of the area. And always start with where marginal revenue and marginal cost intersect at point A. But that is not the area of profit. Notice how the area of profit is not at point A, it's right where the cost is. Make sure to remember that point. A monopoly is very different than perfect competitive markets. Monopolies are just firms that dominate the industry, that have excessive power, that dominate the industry, or have established themselves as the main provider of the good, have limited competition, or bought out the producers that attempted to compete, or set barriers to entry, and so on. A competitive industry, there's many producers, and they charge a price that is equal to its marginal costs. Now that's the ideal market. You will actually find firms that don't charge the price that is equivalent to their marginal costs. Otherwise, they are going to have no economic profit. That's normal returns. If you charge a price equal to your marginal costs. This is a theoretical implication that the ideal perfectly competitive market charges a price that is fair, that is low, and that is equivalent to marginal cost. So we have this situation. The price in competitive markets is equivalent to the marginal cost of the last unit produced, and we have the situation where the marginal revenue of each unit produced is equivalent to the marginal cost of the unit produced. In other words, you charge the consumer the same that it might have cost you to produce it, of the last unit in this case. So we have a firm that it's profit maximizing at that point. The price is equivalent to the marginal cost. And sometimes they make a profit, sometimes they may incur a loss, and sometimes they may break even. In the long run, perfectly competitive markets break even. So a monopoly charges traditionally a higher price for its good or service, above everything, above marginal revenue, above marginal cost, and above average total cost, and above all of the average, all of the costs that could be produced. So monopolies are very powerful in terms of price setting behavior. So the price is greater than the marginal revenue per unit. That's why the marginal revenue has a downward slope. It's decreasing as you produce more output. If you have to cut price, the marginal revenue is downward sloping, and it's greater than the marginal costs as well. So a monopoly is profit maximizing quantity of output. A monopoly maximizes profit where the price monopoly is greater than marginal revenue, and which is equivalent to marginal cost to produce a particular output. A very interesting point. There's a slight distinction. So what are the essential effects that monopolists have to society? Well, the monopoly captures some of the consumer benefits that are referred to as consumer surplus as profits. In other words, they charge a price, and some consumers are not able to afford it, and they generate some deadweight loss, which is that's the case, the loss of transactions that are no longer taking place. Some transactions don't take place because monopolies charge a higher price, and in charging that higher price, they capture some consumer benefits in the form of profit. In other words, what the consumer could have saved is now becoming the monopoly's profit to some extent. Governments can potentially prevent the formation of monopoly or limit their effects through several things: antitrust policy, government regulations, price regulation, or taking over the monopoly, making it a public entity. Sometimes public organizations are poorly managed and poorly run, or setting antitrust policies that can limit the formation of monopolies. But monopolies tend to happen, or at least the structure of monopolies. So we have several firms that are dominating industries that are exercising monopoly power. There may be a fine line between exercising monopoly power, monopoly structure, or being a pure monopoly. There's fine lines between those two. But for the most part, the Luxottica, which is a private firm, actually it's a company that is traded in Wall Street that owns most of the eyeglasses that we wear in the eyewear industry. So the inefficiencies attributed to monopolies are very important and significant to the consumer. So under perfectly competitive markets, in this case, our consumer demand, which is illustrated by the demand curve downward sloping, intersects the marginal cost curve and the average total cost at point competitive, this start point. The price under perfectly competitive markets, it's a low fair price to the consumer, and the consumer consumes that quantity that's equivalent to the marginal cost per unit and equivalent to the average total costs per unit. And if you recall, the price under perfectly competitive markets is equivalent to the marginal revenue. So essentially, the marginal revenue per unit, the price of the unit, the marginal cost of the unit, and the average total cost in the ideal perfectly competitive market or in the ideal market are all equivalent, and they're all relatively low, very accessible and cheap, and the quantity is high. So the consumer has a consumer benefit, which is represented by this blue area, by getting the product at a low price. The consumer benefits by having a lot of the good at a low price, and if you pay a low price, you benefit by, consider this saving a lot, having extra funds, surplus of funds that is between the price and the below the demand curve. It is considered as consumer surplus. Notice how the model is going to change once we introduce a monopoly. A monopoly is going to capture some of this blue area that is considered profits, that is considered consumer surplus, as profits. So as soon as we introduce the monopoly restricts the quantity of output produced, it lowers the quantity to quantity monopoly, produces less units, and it sets a higher price. The price monopoly is now a lot higher than competitive markets, is significantly higher in this graph visually. And we now have a rectangle area where marginal revenue, notice how it's not here, this is downward sloping in a monopoly. Marginal revenue, marginal cost intersect, they produce less output, a lot less than competitive markets, half as much, in some cases even less. And they charge a monopoly's price. When the price is high and you have low output, you generate profits. Some of this consumer benefits, consumer surplus, have become the monopoly's profit. And now we have this yellow area that has become a loss to society, deadweight loss. What does that mean? Is that a lot of transactions are no longer taking place that have become lost because now the company has privatized or charged a significant high price for the good or service and to generate profits, and some consumers cannot afford it, cannot buy it, or are not buying it anymore, and they're lost. So we take the area of this triangle, 1/2 the base times the height, which is the height between the price of the monopoly minus the cost, to find the value of this deadweight loss. You can actually see the loss of transaction when we have numeric values. We had the case of 16 units here, and if the monopoly produces 8, you lose 8 consumers. Some people are not going to be able to buy the product, make some profits, and their consumer benefit is only for those that are buying the good or service. The model changed significantly. So some of the monopoly in this case captured some of the consumer surplus of funds as profits and generated losses. Consider this the case of the situation where people cannot afford some products because they're expensive. There's a loss to society, the value, but the company is making a profit. And the consumer that buy it is the one and only that benefits the most. Now, we have been mainly discussing the situation of a market monopoly, a private monopoly, but what about a natural monopoly? When do they exist and how can they become a natural producer of the good? Natural monopolists exist when they experience what is called economies of scale. Economies of scale provide a provide a large cost advantage to one single firm that produces goods and services for all of the industry. So consider one company that established itself as the main provider of the good. This one is relatively to the benefit of the public to some extent, because one company can produce it at a lower average cost and more output than multiple firms. And a natural monopoly typically arises when it has economies of scale. When you increase production, you scale your production in big quantities, and your average cost declines. That's what economies of scale means in a nutshell. Your output increases, and your average cost of producing that output declines. So sometimes it's better to have one company produce that output at a lower cost than multiple companies with higher costs. So the average total cost curve declines as you produce more output. And that could be beneficial, because if you have a company that is producing the good or service at an average cost that is cheaper, then they may possibly offer a lower price to the consumer. Sometimes, not always. So what companies fall under these conditions? Companies that are public, monopolies, publicly run companies could be in this category, that we just have one single firm, or a company that produces a product for the entire industry. So the monopolist has typically lower average total cost than any other smaller firm. When we have a situation in natural monopoly, the monopolists have lower average cost than any other firm. So basically, one company can produce everything cheaper rather than having small companies having high cost of operations. So just let one company operate by itself. So what does economies of scale mean? Well, economies of scale here, it means that as your consumers demand output, your average cost of production declines. So you notice how your average cost of production is declining. That allows you to charge lower prices to the consumer that is demanding that product, and your quantity can increase significantly. A natural monopoly can break even if it charges the price that is equivalent to their average total cost of production for any relevant output produced, to be quite significant in the production process, equivalent to the consumer demand. If they charge a little bit higher price, then they could make some profit still, but they can probably provide it cheaper than a private monopoly that may just charge a higher price. Sometimes private monopolies do experience low ATCs. Natural monopoly typically have a lower average total cost on average for relevant outputs. Now, what companies fall in this category? Utility companies. Utility companies that produce accessible goods to consumers, like the gas company, the water company, the Department of Water and Power, or the gas company. You just have one gas company providing the goods and services for thousands of consumers in a city, rather than having multiple gas companies producing the water, the gas lines, and so on. Just have one. So utility companies, for the most part, some of them maybe. Then you have the private ones, so you have to be careful as to the boundary between natural monopoly versus private or market monopolies. So preventing monopoly can be quite beneficial for society's welfare. You can prevent a monopoly by regulating a monopoly, or preventing the inefficiencies that are created because of a monopoly. Sometimes profit maximizing monopolies causes inefficiencies. They tend to charge a higher price to the consumer, greater than the cost. That is bad for the consumers that cannot afford a good. Some transactions do not take place because of the high price in the market. So we're looking to regulate a monopoly. Public policy making can regulate monopolies through taking control of it, through public ownership. The good is simply supplied by the government, or it's government-owned, government-run, but sometimes publicly owned companies are not as good. Sometimes the private sector may provide some benefits, depends. The United States may implement a price regulation, in some cases, a combination of both. Let the company run as a privately owned firm, but through price regulation, or a utility company that is natural monopoly through price regulation. Set a price ceiling, the maximum price the firm can charge, and no more than that regulated price ceiling. Setting the maximum price the monopolist can charge is important because it doesn't allow the firm to set a higher price but still allows them to make some profits that are a little bit less than what they would normally do. Often cases, the firms can create pricing strategies, which means engage in price discrimination, set different prices to different consumers or in different markets to maximize their own profits. Think about the airline industry. The airline industry, when you travel, they charge different prices to front row seaters, middle of the plane, and the back of the plane, aisle seats versus window seats, first class, and so on. Those are examples of price discrimination. And price discrimination is relatively profitable when consumers differ in the sensitivity to price. Some consumers are willing to pay a high price, some consumers are willing to pay a low price, some consumers are willing to wait till there's a sale. So a monopolist can charge potentially a different price to different consumers, or to the same consumer, depending on how the consumer is feeling in terms of consumption. We have a single price monopoly that charges one price only for a good, and then we have monopolists that can charge different prices for the good or service to different consumers with different elasticities of consumption. I know the word discrimination sounds a little bit bad because of the kind of the meaning that it may have, but this is referred to as a more precise one, pricing strategy, which is possible and is done by multiple companies. The firms charges high prices to consumers that are willing to pay them without driving away others that are willing to pay less. It has to do with the elasticity of consumption. If you're highly elastic, you may not pay the high price. But if you are inelastic, you may pay the high price, depending on the consumer itself. Different types of price discriminatory strategies consist of perfectly discriminating every consumer. You charge everyone what they're willing to pay. The high price to the high players that are willing to pay the high price. A medium price to some that are willing to pay somewhere of a high price. Lower prices to low income or lower willingness to pay consumers, and low prices to everybody that is willing to pay just $1 for a good. Perfect price discrimination is charging every consumer what they're willing to pay. It's possible, but it cannot be achieved in the market. So most companies go into price ranges. Price ranges meaning like they can set a price range where to accept. Or you can have second-degree price discrimination or pricing strategy. Again, I'm replacing the word price discrimination to a pricing strategy. Second-degree price discrimination or pricing strategy. You charge different prices for different quantities that you're offering to the market. Third-degree price strategy is you just charge different prices to different markets. The West Coast market to the East Coast market, Central market, and so on, or in different communities, in different areas. That's possible. That's a little bit fine line topic right there. But it's possible depending on the income of the region, or not just the price, but the actual good could be different in terms of functionality. The best example is the airline industry. If you're willing to pay for first class, you can pay that price. If you're willing to pay a different price for regular class, then you can pay that price. Different markets. You have the high executive class, platinum class, priority seating class, etc. You may actually see it. So let's take a look how this looks graphically. Graphically, we have the demand for the good or service, the consumer demand. The consumer pays a high price to those that are willing to pay the high price, and a lower price to the consumer that is willing to pay a lower price, and if anything, to the consumer that is willing just to pay at cost. This is if you're just willing to pay cost, and you get the lowest price. So in different cases, you want to charge prices to different consumers. You want to charge the higher price to the consumer that is willing to pay it, the lower price to the consumer that is willing to pay a little bit less, depending on the market and where it is. And sometimes you can have a product that only has two prices, and the product itself may be slightly different. This one may be the high-end product, and this one may be just the regular product. Monopolies can change their product in terms of functionality when you start to get into a real-world application. It's just not one standard good. There's multiple goods that have different prices. Think about, for example, in this case, the different discrimination with 3 different prices. When we use the analogy of the iPhone, we have the $1,000 iPhone, in this case, which is one company that developed this smartphone technology. It did have the monopoly power at first. Now we have multiple companies with multiple smartphones, but let's use this scenario. The higher price for a $1,000 good to charge them to consumers that are willing to pay a higher price. The medium price to consumers with medium willingness to pay. The product may be the same brand, the same feature, but slightly different memory. And then you have the lower price to the consumers with a willingness to pay of a lot less. Then this just maybe the entry-level phone, but with the same features, but with limited capabilities. Again, the products could be slightly different. In some cases, you have a single price product that is exactly the same at all stages. When you start to price discriminate, you may offer the same experience, the same type of good, the same brand, but with different features. Thank you for joining the discussion of Monopoly. We'll continue with our next session. Have a good afternoon. Enjoy the rest of your day.